In this lecture, we're going to continue our discussion of reporting health research through the examination of the original research paper. One of the most important elements of the original research paper is the results section. And what we're looking at here is the specific results section of the example research paper used in this lecture. And so the major heading here is results, but this paper included 5 different subsections that gets to the a very detailed examination of the various elements that were examined in that particular research paper. And it's important to note that not all research papers will necessarily have 5 subsections as shown here for this particular research paper, but the number of subsections will often have subheadings or will not have subheadings. But the main point here is that the results outlined are provided with a significant amount of detail, as we saw with the method section. Going back to the abstract or the summary that we observed at the beginning of the research paper, the results section of that abstract represented a very small yet most important element of the results section. But if we wish to have more detail, then we have to go into the main body of the paper and examine the fine details for all of the data that were generated out of that particular study. One very effective way of conveying results is through different types of graphs. And what we're looking at here on this particular graph is the amount of beta carotene. And in this particular study, beta carotene was the important nutrient of interest among the investigators that was absorbed by the research participants, and the parentheses indicate the units of measurement for the amount of this particular type of beta carotene that was observed. So the y-axis will outline our outcome variable, or often referred to as our dependent variable, and the value taken along the y-axis will be a function of or depend upon the time. And in this case, the amount of beta carotene absorbed was tracked among the research participants over a 24-hour period of time. So although we have 25 hours here on the x-axis, this is done in equal increments. The actual observed data we see just stops shy of 25, which tells us that these measures were obtained periodically over a 24-hour window. And the graphic presentation is very effective at comparing how much of this particular nutrient was absorbed by the research participants depending over the 24-hour period, depending upon how the food that contains that nutrient, in other words the carrots, were consumed. And so the open circle or the open diamond symbol here represents the amount of beta carotene absorbed when those carrots were consumed in a raw form. The carrots that were cooked and pureed demonstrated a different response in terms of the amount of beta carotene observed. And so what we see here at the very first time point beyond the ingestion period is that the amount of the beta carotene absorbed was greater in the squared scenario, the squared condition, which is the pureed carrot, than the condition when the participants consumed carrots that were raw. And that pattern was sustained all through the 24-hour period. And graphs in research papers will often use an asterisk or some other symbol, and whenever you see that symbol, that will indicate some unique pattern that observed. And in quantitative research, that pattern is indicated by what's called statistical significance. So that tells us from a statistical perspective the amount of beta carotene that was absorbed by the participants was statistically significantly greater when those carrots were cooked and pureed than when the carrots were consumed raw. And that pattern of absorption continued all the way through a 24-hour period with respect to the form of carrot preparation. The results section can also present the summarized data in a table form. And so what we're seeing here are four measures that were obtained in terms of what's called transit time. And transit time was defined by the researchers in the methods section. The important point to note here is that these are outcome variables that were measured, and whether it's a graph or a table, the parentheses have to indicate the units of measurement. And so what the researchers were measuring, among many things, is something called lag phase in terms of hours. And we see that raw carrots and pureed carrots had a different lag phase. And the asterisk here indicates that there's something going on, and we'll get to that here shortly. When presenting summarized data in a table, just below the table, it should always be additional detail should always be made available here. And so the actual numerical values represent the mean and the plus minus the standard deviation of the 8 volunteers for each of these 4 outcome variables, presented in hours, or percent per hour. And this table also lists definitions for the outcome measurement as a convenient location for the reader. So the reader does not necessarily have to go back to the methods section to look for the definitions if they don't remember lag phase, half time, end time, and slope. They can read that right below the table. And the table should also include definitions for any unique symbols that appear in the table. And as we saw on slide number 8 with the graph with the asterisk, here we see an asterisk, but we also see a double asterisk. And so the single asterisk indicates statistical significance that's less than 0.01. The double asterisk indicates a statistical significance at a p-value of less than 0.07. So however the researchers define this has to be indicated very clearly in the results section, whether it's a graph or a table, and this is done for the benefit of the reader. The final section of a research paper is called the discussion section. And what you see here is that journals will post a very apparent heading in terms of what's called discussion. Now, the discussion section is the most variable part of a research paper that varies from study to study. Essentially, all discussion sections should provide an outline of the major findings of the study. Basically, the discussion section is the results section in words. Now, the discussion section can also include some of the numerical values because that will aid in the description of the outcome, and we see that on the right-hand side. And so in the discussion section of our example paper, here we see more words than we do numbers, but we also see some values, 41.4 plus minus 7.4%, 65.1 plus minus 7.4%, because this brings some context to the sentences that the authors wrote for the discussion section. The discussion section is a location where the author should also very briefly revisit the purpose of the study and remind the reader why this study was carried out. if the authors, and not all papers will do this, but if at the end of the introduction section, if the authors had outlined any hypotheses, then the discussion section should not just revisit the purpose of the study, but should also definitely revisit the hypotheses and state whether those research hypotheses were confirmed or refuted. The discussion section should sometimes will list the strengths of the paper, sometimes the weaknesses of the study. I think it's more appropriate to indicate not necessarily the weakness, but the limitations of the methodology and the conclusions that were arrived at from that particular research study. Usually the end of a discussion section will also outline future directions of the studied subject, and as well in terms of guiding the next steps that on how the results of the study can be harnessed and be applied in the future, either from a practical clinical perspective or from a practical research perspective. And of course, following the discussion section will appear the references and a separate section called the acknowledgments section. And the acknowledgments section will often include any reference to funding support that was used for the research study. And the acknowledgement section will also include the names of individuals that were not, very important here, that were not co-authors, where their involvement in the study didn't rise to the level of making a substantial contribution, but still made what's considered a minor contribution to the study, which might have included the processing of any laboratory elements that were collected, or assisting with data entry into a software program, for example, where those individuals were not tied into the development of the study, but they provided some assistance when the authors needed that extra help. So this ends this lecture on the overall structure of a research report.